Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 8 July 2024. It is the 139th anniversary of the birth of Ernst Bloch, who was born in Ludwigshafen on this date in 1885. Ernst Bloch, not to be confused with Mark Bloch, about whom I spoke a couple of days ago, was a Marxist philosopher of history. A great many Marxists are unbearably dull to read, but Bloch was his own man, and he didn't allow a party orthodoxy to dictate his views. We could say that he was an internal critic of Marxism who remained an internal critic throughout his life, neither becoming an orthodox Marxist nor leaving the Marxist fold entirely. That is to say, always remaining a critic and always remaining a Marxist. And this is a rare thing in the philosophy of history. Another rare feature of his thought is that his interest in religion. Before his major works were available in English translation, a number of his writings from various sources were published as man on his own, essays in the philosophy of religion. So according to the editors of that book, he was an essayist in the philosophy of religion. Most Marxists followed Marx in their contempt for religion as the opium of the people. But there are mixed motives for this contempt. Bertrand Russell, who was no less contemptuous of religion than most Marxists, called Marxism a surrogate religion in which Marx is the Messiah, the proletariat are the elect, the Communist Party is the church, the second coming is the revolution, hell is the punishment of the capitalists, and the millennium is the communist commonwealth. Parallel to Russell's conception of surrogate religion, Eric Voegelin wrote an essay on what he called ersatz religion, which was a false substitute for the real thing, that is to say, for genuine religion. What Voegelin calls the Gnostic mass movements of our time were ersatz religion, and Marxism is counted in Voegelin's category of Gnostic mass movements. Criticisms like this have become so common that most people have heard at one time or another communism dismissed as a substitute for religious belief. And that was one of the motivations for Marxist philosophers of history to distance themselves from religion. But Bloch was different. Rather than rejecting religious concepts and categories, he enthusiastically embraced them, and he did not hesitate to apply them both to his own ideology and to that of others as well. Bloch went as far to say is that, quote, messianism is the red secret of every revolutionary, unquote. This may or may not surprise you. Walter Benjamin, who was a rather more consistent Marxist than Bloch, perhaps we could say that he was a more radical Marxist than Bloch, wrote extensively about messianism in his well-known essay on the concept of history. But anyone who has read on the concept of history and anything by Bloch will be aware of the great abyss that separates Bloch from Benjamin, though the two were friends and knew each other. But I'll talk more about Benjamin next week on his birthday. Bloch spent more than a decade of his life in the U.S. from 1938 to 1949. But it seems that Bloch was not among the in-crowd of German expatriates in the U.S., as he wasn't invited to join Horkheimer's Institute for Social Research. Bloch's wife worked as a waitress and a secretary at an architectural firm to support the couple. Adorno made appeals to help Bloch, who was very nearly impoverished, but he didn't use his influence to get Bloch hired at the Institute for Social Research, so clearly there were definite limits to Adorno's charity. Like Said Qutb, who was in the U.S. about the same time as Bloch, Bloch didn't care much for the U.S. and his way of life, but he did write his major work, the 3-volume The Principle of Hope, while he was living in the U.S. The translators of The Principle of Hope say that the book, quote, bristles with anti-American sentiments, unquote. But he did eventually become a U.S. citizen, and I have read in a couple of sources that his citizenship examiner was so fascinated by his account of the American Revolution that he brought in his colleagues to listen to Bloch. And I can say I would have very much liked to have been a fly on the wall for that citizenship interview. In 1949, Bloch was offered a professorship of philosophy at Leipzig, so he returned to Germany to help build the first socialist German state. For a time, he was regarded as something like the official political philosopher of the German Democratic Republic, similar to how some people have called Jürgen Habermas the de facto official philosopher of the European Union. But Bloch revised his views following the 1956 uprising in Hungary and the Soviet response to the Hungarian uprising, and he was forced into retirement in 1957. In 1961, he was vacationing in West Berlin when the Berlin Wall was started, and he stayed in the West, eventually becoming a professor at Tübingen. I've given more biographical detail on Bloch than on most of the philosophers of history I've discussed because I think it's relevant to the development of his thought. Bloch was, by turns, both embraced and spurned by his fellow Marxists. He became influential in the GDR and then became effectively exiled. And he disliked the US, but he wrote his major work while he was staying here. Bloch's major work, The Principle of Hope, is essentially about utopias, surveying utopias in all their many forms. He particularly cites medical utopias, social utopias, technological utopias, architectural utopias, and geographical utopias. And the themes of his thought all cluster around the utopian ideal: hope, striving toward and striving into the future, possibility, and potentiality. One of the concepts of potentiality that he formulated was what he called the not yet conscious. Another concept of potentiality was the quasi-logical formulation, S is not yet P. So why do I call this a quasi-logical formulation? For those who aren't familiar, in textbooks of traditional philosophical logic, the syllogism was usually given the form all S are M, all M are P, therefore all S are P. In such renditions of the syllogism, S stands for the subject term, M stands for the middle term, and P stands for the predicate term. Variations on the syllogistic theme yield the various figures and moods of the syllogism, as they were traditionally called. Bloch gave a 20th century twist to this ancient formulation of the syllogism. Every philosopher who read Bloch would have been familiar with these terms of traditional logic, so that in taking over S and P in his proposition, he was appealing to something ancient in philosophy. And for the ancients, the timeless embodiment of rationality is logic. Bloch put the subject and predicate terms into a temporal relation, and not just a temporal relation, but a relationship of potentiality in time. S is not yet P implies that S may become P, but that S and P are still at this time distinct, and it is by no means certain that S will definitely become P, much less that it will necessarily become P. S becoming P is a possibility only. You could even say that it is an aspiration or a hope that S will become P, but that hope is not yet realized. There is also the possibility that S will not become P, or never fully become P, but may stagnate at a point that falls short of P. S is not yet P then remains a hope only, and a hope unfulfilled at this time. Harvey Cox related an anecdote about this formulation that's somewhat amusing. Quote, "What does Bloch help us to see? How would his thought be capsulated if it had to be described in a few words? Bloch himself," Adolf Low reports, "was once faced with this challenge. A few years back, at a late afternoon tea in the home of a friend, someone challenged the old man to sum up his philosophy in one sentence. All great philosophers have been able to reduce their thought to one sentence," the friend said. "What would your sentence be?" Bloch puffed on his pipe for a moment and then said, "That's a hard trap to get out of. If I answer, then I'm making myself out to be a great philosopher. But if I'm silent, then it will appear as if I have a great deal in mind, but not much to say. But I'll play the brash one instead of the silent one and give you this sentence: S is not yet P," unquote. This story does wonderfully encapsulate Bloch's philosophical interest, which is expressed in many different ways across many books. Bloch's one-line summary of his philosophy is a formalization of hope, which is eminently appropriate since his magnum opus is called the principle of hope. In an essay entitled Man as a Possibility, which is a paradigmatically Blochian theme, Bloch made this observation, quote, openness toward the future is a large category with a sort of stepmother character. One must plunge beyond the horizon into that very difficult sphere of reality, the sphere of the novum. And this is not the reality which is being present, nor the reality in process, but the reality of the not yet. This is the sphere of the novum, the place where deeds are measured, the realm of fear as well as of hope, unquote. The idea of man as possibility is a special case of the idea that S is not yet P. And this above anecdote might also imply a special case of man and possibility, and therefore even a narrower sense of S is not yet P. A friend pointed out to me once that Bloch, in saying S is not yet P, may have been a sly way for Bloch to say of himself that he was himself not yet P. That is, he was not yet a great philosopher and was not yet able to reduce the whole of his thought to a single sentence. If this is the case, if this was Bloch's sly implication, the anecdote is a beautiful paradoxical summation of his thought, as Bloch has expressed in his status of being not yet, in such a way as to confirm that he already has, in a sense, arrived at the status of being a great philosopher. The man who is not yet a great philosopher, and humanity, which is still a possibility and could become many things or nothing at all, and in the most formal expression, any P, any S that is not yet P, have the possibility of becoming a great philosopher or fulfilling some possibility of becoming P in an open future, which Bloch discussed in the above quote. If S is not yet P, and S can become P, but will not necessarily become P, then an open, undetermined, and perhaps even undefined future is posed to us. We see then how these themes interlock and imply each other, giving a unity to Bloch's diverse thought. Could we build on Bloch's quasi-logical formulation, S is not yet P, and elaborate this beyond what Bloch himself proposed? Can we transcend Bloch's S is not yet P, so that even a philosophy of the not yet is itself not yet? How would a Blochian logic of hope be formulated? Would it be valid in a Blochian logic to argue that S is not yet M is not yet P, therefore S is not yet P? In other words, is hope a transitive relation? Is hope for personal salvation also hope for universal salvation, because our hope for our own fate is a transitive relation that flows through on to others and so on universally? Or do we run into the fatal equivalent of a ex falso quodlibet, where a false hope explosively extends itself to contaminate every authentic hope? We stand in need of a schematization that will allow us to systematically distinguish and to interrelate propositions such as S is not yet P, S will become P, S is becoming P, S is almost P, S will never become P, S was once P, S is no longer P, and so on. Can logic become a logic of hope, even though logic is not yet a logic of hope? In other words, can S become P? Obviously, an undetermined future in which possibilities may be actualized is a realm of freedom. And on freedom, Bloch wrote, quote, freedom, and this is something that was not made explicit in any of the previous concepts of freedom, in all of its levels, as freedom of choice and of action, as ethical and religious, is founded only contra factum, thus in a perspective of a still open world, not yet determined at all the way into the end. This is where the continual revolutionary accent on freedom comes from. This is where the essential irreconcilability of freedom with closed determinateness comes from, a determinateness in which there was no possibility of the intervention of the subject that was born of the freedom of choice or action. Only a partial determinability of the world, thus an as yet unclosed possibility, makes freedom possible in this world. Enough said here about the first, most vivid color in the tricolor of natural law and its true place. Freedom is the mode of human comportment in the face of objective real possibility. Only thus does its purpose have any margin of play on the path that leads to the content of freedom, the unalienated humanum, unquote. We can sense here the struggle in Bloch's thought as he tries to come to terms with what possibility means, what it must mean, or what it ought to mean for human beings. And here's another on that same quote. There is a maxim of verification which involved so little correspondence to the facts that it brought about the English, American, and French revolutions. 1,000 years of injustice do not justify 1 hour of them. The basic proposition arising from a consideration of the humanum intimately connected with morality, as presented by classical natural law, was wholly opposed to verification on the basis of nothing other than the potential status quo, that is, of injustice as it had come to be, as it was. Hence the difference between this and an accommodation of thought to facts is particularly clear. The illuminating direction of the human postulate would direct rather than be directed by nothing but fact. All the worse for the facts, which means in this case, philosophical reason is not imagination that has grown wise through injury in such a way that it behaves only heuristically and thus attains validity and prevails. Rather, there is a primacy of practical reason, that is, of the concrete humanization of all world situations and conditions in the logic of philosophy as well. Then mere facticity has no right to interfere, for that right is possessed only by the tendency of the process and especially the latency of objective world possibility. And so the indicated direction of humane supposition did not remain philosophically restricted to morality and its immediate context. Indeed, the right not to be a dog, this large-scale postulatory supposition with so little empirical confirmation, is not so very distant from some of the intellectual fairy tales of the great philosophers, insofar as the latter display sublime perfection in the completed initial experiment, unquote. Bloch paradoxically expresses himself in the language of philosophy and even in the language of formal logic while calling both into question. Similarly, he paradoxically expresses himself both in the language of Marxism and the language of theology. In other philosophers, these paradoxical expressions would not work as well. But Bloch writes poetically, if not prophetically, and this gives his thought an interest and an urgency lacking in a lot of philosophical thought. And Bloch ends his book, The Principle of Hope, with the paradoxical and prophetic claim that, quote, true Genesis is not at the beginning, but at the end, unquote. I'm going to quote more from this final paragraph to give some context to this paradoxical thought, but giving more context in this case means bringing in more ambiguous element that only make it all the more puzzling. But anyway, more context nevertheless. Quote, there is no doubt at all, and no doubt was left about it. An unilluminated, undirected hope can easily merely lead astray. For the true horizon does not extend beyond the knowledge of realities. But precisely this knowledge, when instead it is Marxist and not mechanistic, shows reality itself as one of the horizon, and informed hope as one commensurate with this reality. The goal as a whole is and remains still concealed, the absolute of the will and of hope still unfound in the agent of existing, the light of its whatness, of its essence, of its intended fundamental content itself has not yet dawned. And yet the nunc stans of the driving moment, of the striving filled with its content, stands ahead, utopian and clear. But precisely also the human capacity for such an absolute concept of goal is the tremendous aspect in an existence where the best still remains patchwork, where every end again and again becomes a means to serve the still utterly opaque, indeed, in and for itself still unavoidable fundamental goal, final goal. Marx describes as his final concern the development of the wealth of human nature. This human wealth, as well as that of nature as a whole, lies solely in the latency in which the world finds itself, vis-a-vis a tout. This glance, therefore, confirms that man everywhere is still living in prehistory. Indeed, all and everything still stands before the creation of the world, of a right world. True Genesis is not at the beginning, but at the end. And it starts to begin only when society and existence become radical, that is, grasp their roots. But the root of history is the working, creating human being who reshapes and overhauls the given facts. Once he has grasped himself and established what is his without expropriation and alienation in real democracy, there arises in the world something which shines into the childhood of all and in which no one has yet been, homeland, unquote. This is from the final paragraph of The Principle of Hope, but it's only about half of that paragraph. If you read the original, you'll see how much more there is in it, since Bloch threw about everything into it but the kitchen sink. It seems that everything in Bloch is what William James called a live option. All of these disparate elements are intrinsic and essential to Bloch's thought. We cannot understand what Bloch is getting at if we leave out the philosophy, the logic, the Marxism, the theology, or the prophetic voice in which they are communicated. Perhaps it takes this kind of muddle to do justice to the muddle that is history. So happy birthday, Ernst Bloch, and thanks for listening.